A big part of my research asks the question of what is and what counts as intellectual life and public culture, as well as what kinds of people do we recognize as public intellectuals. In my view, asking those kinds of questions that my research addresses also involves confronting how we define such concepts. Yet, the majority of the existing literature on public intellectuals, or rather the sociology of public intellectuals, seems to shy away from precisely that question. To give you an example, certain forms of intellectual life are almost automatically, if not unthinkingly, privileged, while others tend to be marginalized, if not criminalized too. To give another example, think of the difference between a novelist, who is almost automatically seen as an intellectual, instead of a graffiti writer, who will probably be seen as a troublemaker who might even face the possibility of arrest by the police. In my research, I therefore ask who is, who can be, and what does it mean to be a public intellectual? But I go against the mainstream that defines public intellectuals as men of letters, for it is mostly men, who speak to publics that listen passively. Instead, I broaden the definition of public intellectuals, at least in my work, in a way that includes society's outcasts, who are almost inescapably public and engage with publics that talk back, rather than simply sit back and listen passively to an omniscient sage or an intellectual figure who tells them what the world is like, even if that might not agree with their own personal experience. This inevitably involves a radical shift in how we think about the intellect, public life, and who we recruit for such a role. I therefore argue that thinking and intellectual activity, in fact the intellect itself, is an embodied practice which involves the senses and the whole mind rather than just the head or the brain. Public life often happens where we don't look and where we don't care to tread, for instance, society's margins. And lastly, and most importantly, I seek to replace the notion of the public intellectual with that of the public character, as Jane Jacobs described it. And the difference between the two is that the public intellectual seems to think about and act on publics, whereas the public character thinks and acts in public. So some candidates for such a role, that is, public characters rather than public intellectuals, would be rappers, breakdancers, performance artists, or skateboarders. The take-home message from my research, therefore, is the desire to urge us to retool our thinking in order to recognize and literally rethink the way we think about different forms of intellectual life, different varieties of public expression, but also how and who do we admit to the ranks of the intellect and culture. All this matters if we want to properly study and understand people, produce challenging knowledges, and relate to the world as it is rather than as we are.